So for those of you who literally had to change your schedule to be here, thank you. Some of you are retired and have a little more flexibility. Nonetheless, you took a beautiful day like today to be inside asking questions. Thank you as well. To those that were outside who met me, who were here to make a point and had signs and thought that they were here in protest, thank you for coming. I mean it sincerely, because the purpose of this is to answer questions, no matter whose questions they are, no matter what they're about, to talk about, as Senator Bowen just did, why we're even here. What is it that has forced this issue? So I'll touch on just a few things in general, and what I'll ask of you, there is a microphone here. If you're a person who's very quiet of voice, feel free to use that. Otherwise, if you, just to make it easier on you as we start to go forward, if you just have a question, just raise your hand, and I'll get to you as we move around. I'll repeat your question so that everybody can hear it. As long as I can hear it, I'll just repeat it so people understand it. So if you have a question, no matter where you are, just sound off with those and we'll go ahead and address them. But let me just back up just a little bit and speak to how it is that we even found ourselves here in the first place. I mean, these numbers that you just heard are real numbers. Every one of them, the highest first digit was a 5. Some of them remarkably, some of them a fraction of what the largest numbers were. If these were private sector plans, and you say, well, why does that matter? Let me explain something. There is no backstop for a publicly offered pension system, except the good faith, goodwill, and taxpayers' dollars. But there's a finite amount of those, whether we want to believe that or not. The federal government has the luxury of being able to print money. We don't. So a state has a certain amount of money it has, and that's all it has. And so a promise, no matter what that promise is only as good as the ability of the person who made the promise to deliver on it. That's just the harsh reality, but true enough. So how then do you guarantee that the promises that have been made can be delivered on? If in fact, as has been happening for a long time, people have been misled, if in fact numbers have been thrown out and promises have been made that people knew they couldn't fulfill, eventually that game has to stop. That gig has to end at some point. People have to be told the truth. When I was the only person running on either side that would put in writing what it was that they would do if they were elected. Some of you remember this, some of you may not. I put out something called a blueprint for a better Kentucky. You can go back and read it. It's still online somewhere. I'm sure you could Google it up. Blueprint for a better Kentucky. There were only 7 points in it. They were very specific. They were fiscal and financial in large measure, primarily because those are the things that affect all of us. Those are the things that allow us to be successful or not as a society. We have to be economically sound. It's the same for this city. It's the same for this state. It's the same for this region, this nation, whatever the case might be. So I was very specific, not only in what I put in writing, what I talked about at every pension stop that I came to. I was maybe in this room or some combination of this room a couple of years ago when I was meeting with a bunch of sheriffs, having this conversation. Every debate, we had this conversation. Every time it came up, I said very specifically, we are going to have to address this. People have not been shooting straight. People, for a variety of reasons, some intentional, some not intentional, some because they were informed, some because they were intentionally misinformed. But for a combination of reasons, from a variety of different sources, we have found ourselves in this position. But the point is, we've been misleading people with respect to the financial viability of our state. We have. Who hasn't been fooled? The credit rating agencies, Fitch's, S&P, Moody's. You say, well, who cares what they think? Well, you would care if it was your personal financial situation and you had to go get a loan somewhere. You wanted to buy a car or a house. If your credit rating is of no value to somebody, they're not going to lend you money. It's the same for a state. We have the worst credit rating of any state in America, minus a couple. There's only 3 or 4, depending on who's doing the rating, that have a lesser credit rating than we do. That means that our ability to even borrow is limited, and the cost at which we must borrow is higher than others. This ultimately comes at the expense of our ability to do the kind of things that we need and want to do to be viable and to grow. These are, again, harsh realities. We have been downgraded on multiple occasions in recent years by these credit rating agencies, Fitch's, S&P, and Moody's. They have, every time they've downgraded us, specifically mentioned, sometimes as the primary reason, the fact that we have the worst funded pension system in America. These numbers are correct, and I'll come back to that and why I was saying if this were the private sector. I'll come back to that in a moment. But you think about this. This is not something that we made up. It's not something we would wish on ourselves. But this is why we're having this frank conversation. It's why I ran on it. There were two reasons that I ran. This is the first political job that I've ever had. I didn't groom myself for this. I didn't aspire to this. I didn't say, hey, someday I want to be the guy standing in front of people and telling them the naked truth, which we largely know. This is like the emperor's new clothes. A lot of us for a long time in this state have recognized the emperor's naked. I'm the first person who's willing to stand up here and tell you straight up, straight out that he is. And we know it. And now what are we going to do about realizing that we have to respond to that reality? But I ran on this for two reasons. I ran to fix the pension system, and I ran to fix our broken adoption and foster care system in the state. Those are the two reasons I ran. I didn't need this job or want this job. I'm willing to do this job. And Lord knows it's not because it's a fun job. It's not because it makes everybody happy. It's not because you get a lot of good, positive, constructive feedback. I used to be able to go out to dinner with people and not have people come up and tell me I was evil. You know, that used to be able to happen. But the point is this. I did this willingly. I'm not surprised by it. I don't begrudge it. It's why I'm truly grateful when I hear people who agree and disagree but want to actually have a thoughtful conversation. That's what we should have. That's what good government looks like. So we had two things that I recognized among the many things that needed to be addressed that I truly believed if somebody took them head on, we could do something about. One was to save the pension system from failure. And as was noted by Senator Bowen, we have a failing grade, and it is fast devolving to abject failure. We'll come on back to that in a minute. The other was the foster care and adoption system. We have 8,500 plus kids in foster care. I'll spend just 1 minute on this. 2,400 plus are available for adoption right now. And the average kid waits almost 3 years after they're eligible to be able to be adopted. 2,400 kids. Not all of you are faith people of faith, but many of you are. Many in this state are. We have more than 6,000 churches alone, not to mention how many non-faith-based organizations care about this issue. I mean, if we can't find one home out of every 3 churches for a kid who's eligible and able and desirous of being adopted, shame on us. Shame on us. And if we don't fix a pension system that has a failing grade and is going to fail and is literally going to run out of money, and because we as a state don't have the ability to print money, and if we as a state sold everything we own, every state park, every building, every car, every pencil we owned, it wouldn't equal 10% of how much we owe in unfunded liability. Everything we own wouldn't come up to close to 10% of what we owe. And we don't have the ability to print it. And you can say, well, we'll just take it from people that are already here. Well, guess what? People can move, and they do. Businesses move right across these rivers to other places. People move right to other states. People with means have the ability to go and retire in other places, and they do, and they take their children and grandchildren with them. And if we recognize that and don't do something, shame on us there too. And this is why I ran. And this is why I have been so specific and so repetitive about the need to address this problem. Not because it was going to be fun, not because it was going to be easy, not because anybody under any circumstance in my mind were going to be happy to hear it, but because it absolutely needs to be addressed. So let me come back to the private sector that I was speaking about in a moment. There is in the private sector a number of defined benefit plans that still exist. There haven't been any really created in recent years for a variety of reasons we'll come to in a minute when we talk about demographics and how we found ourselves so severely underfunded. It's important for people to truly understand this. But there's something called the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, PBGC, you often hear it referred to as. By IRS statute, by federal law, if a state or a company, I should say, has a pension plan that is under 80% funded, it's considered in crisis. If it is 60% or below, and every one of these that was just alluded to is below that. By law, the federal government seizes that plan, shuts it down, and pays out anybody who was expecting to get anything out of it 15 cents on the dollar of what they thought they were going to get and that's it. Then it's done. It's like the FDIC. Your bank account is insured against something. You get a certain amount, and that's it. It's backstopped by the people of America. It's the same for the PBGC. It's the same for private sector pension plans. Every single one of our plans would have been shut down. It would have been seized, and anyone who's a retiree or was hoping to be a retiree would have got 15 cents on the dollar at best, and that would be it. There is no equivalent in the public sector. Should there have been? Could there have been? Might there be in the future of necessity? Yes, yes, and yes, probably. But is there? No, there's not. So it's irrelevant to hypothesize about it. There isn't. But the fact is, we still have this obligation. We still owe many, many multiples of everything that we're bringing in. I don't care what number you use. The assumptions that people, you hear, well, it's 40 billion unfunded, it's 60, it's 80. It all depends on what variables you use. How much of an assumed rate of return? How much do you think the markets are going to contribute? How much do you think payroll growth is going to contribute? Depending on how you dial in those numbers, comes up with 40, 60, 80 billion dollars. A conservative blend of all of them, and truthfully, I think 80 is much more realistic, because 80 assumes if we only got the rate of return that we know we could get if we bought long-term treasury bills. To bet you're going to get a higher return than that when you're as severely underfunded as we are is a pretty big risk to take. And yet, let's just assume that we're pegging it to a 30-year treasury note and getting what we know we could get if we bought it, and assuming America doesn't go under, which increasingly with $20 trillion in debt is a stretch in its own right. But that said, let's assume that we're trusting the good faith and credit of the United States of America to pay back those bonds. If we used that as a rate of return, and we assume just a 0% payroll growth, when in fact for 10 straight years in this state, payroll growth has been declining because there's fewer and fewer workers in our systems, and we know that. Assuming just a flat payroll growth, not a declining one, which is what it is, just a flat one, and assuming just a 30-year treasury note return, which is as close as we can get to a guarantee, we have over an $80 billion unfunded liability if we use those two conservative assumptions. Others are telling you it's half that. Well, they have to use crazy assumptions to get to the point that it's half that, because if you assume higher rates of return, which are possible, sure it is. This year the markets are up. We've all remembered when they were down. On average, over time, they do okay. But depending on which assumptions you use, we are many times unfunded and in the hole the entire amount of money we bring in as a state every year. That's just, again, hard, fiscal, sad reality. We bring in $10, $11 billion, not counting monies that flow through from the federal government that are pre-designated for things. Medicaid and other entitlement reforms, Medicare and things of that sort. There's other dollars that come to the state, but not counting those. We don't have the ability to do anything with those other than put them to their intended use. But for the amounts that the state arguably has some control over, a significant portion of which are already spoken for, let's be honest, they are, whether it's through SEEK formula or Veterans Administration or for law enforcement or roads or whatever, the point is a significant portion of our existing dollars are already largely spoken for, but they still equate to about $10 to $11 billion every year. So I don't care what number you use, 40, 60, 80. Let's assume it's in the middle and it's 60. You're talking 5 to 6 times what we bring in. If we just flash froze all of us, and nobody accrued another penny of obligation. Nobody got any older, nobody retired, nobody got sick. We just literally froze us in time, turned off all the lights, let everybody go for 5 or 6 years. And yet somehow people kept sending money in and got nothing in exchange. No law enforcement, no teachers, no roads, no lights, no administration, no paper processors, nothing. We gave them nothing in exchange for 5 to 6 straight years, but they kept paying 100% of what they're paying right now. No one left, and nobody did anything that would add anything to our cost and obligation. It would take 5 to 6 years of that, which is a ludicrous scenario, just to get back to ground level of what we owe, of what's unfunded. That's clearly impossible. It's literally impossible. This is the harsh reality that I am the bearer of, that others have seen to varying degrees. Some, in fairness, really didn't understand it. Some still don't understand it. Others saw it and intentionally disregarded it. Again, it doesn't matter, but this is where we are. It doesn't matter who was which and how much somebody did this, that, or the other thing. This is just the hard reality. So then it comes down to, how do you fix it? How did we get here? Let me touch on that quickly, because everybody wants to know. I hear a lot of favorite theories as to how this happened. This money was stolen, this money was realigned, this money wasn't contributed when it was supposed to be. And there's some elements and basis of truth in almost everything you hear, but much of what you hear is actually not true. That's the sad reality. It is a combination of many things, not the least of which is actuarially required contributions. I hear some people say our legislature didn't put in the money they were supposed to. That's not true. It just isn't true. People could wish they had put more in, and indeed they could have put more in, which they did not, but they put in what they were required by law to do. And if people say, well, the law should have been different, maybe true, maybe so, but it wasn't. So we're dealing with reality, not with hypotheticals or what might have been. And indeed, the legislatures did put in what was required of them. The actuarially required contribution is not mandated to be paid in. Again, you could say, should have been, might have been, would have been if I'd been in charge, but again, it wasn't. It gave the option of maybe being contributed or maybe not. And because that was an option, and we'll come back to this in a moment, when I talk about how we're going to fix this, one of the ways we're going to do it is what's called level dollar funding, which will mandate that this be funded whether we want to or not. We don't get to may not. We will, by law. I'll come back to that. But that was part of it. I've put in the ARC each of the years that I've been governor. I said that I would when I was elected. I said we're going to fund the pension system. We're going to save it. That's the irony, is that myself and this administration, we're the whipping boys. We're the ones being attacked for actually doing what others have said they would do but never did. Nobody was upset with the people who lied. The liars, good, just keep lying to us. You deserve better than that if you're somebody who's in this system. You deserve better than that if you're not in the system, but you're paying for it as a taxpayer. Everybody in Kentucky deserves better than being lied to. So in 12 of the last 15 years, the ARC was not made. Wasn't required to be, and people chose to may not. But let me tell you something. Even if they had made, even if they had put in every single one of those, there were some who believed, see, then we'd be funded. We wouldn't. If we had put in every single ARC based on the assumptions that were being used, we would still be 84% of the hole that we're in right now. Every ARC contributed, and the compounding along the way, we would have filled 16% of the hole we're in right now. Again, however many tens of billions it is, you pick the number. 60? 84% of 60 is how much we'd be underfunded right now. That's the harsh reality of it. So 16% was not meeting all the ARCs along the way. Where'd the other 84% come from? How did we get here? We got here as a result of a couple things. The most powerful contributor that people should have seen, and I believe some did, but everybody ignored, was demographic reality. When these plans were put in place, you had 7, 8, 9 workers down here working somewhere between here and here. These are the retirees up here at the top. And you had 7 or 8 or 9 workers for every retiree. And then as people aged and more people retired, it was 6, 7, 8, 4, 5, 6, 3, 4, 5, 3, 2, 1, 2, 1, 1.5. We now have more retirees than workers in Kentucky. That's not a defined benefit system. These people who say, well, we need more people so that they can pay in to pay my benefits, that gig has been up for years. People are lying to you if they're not telling you that. That is not a pension system that works. That is an inverted wedge that's going to drive itself right into bankruptcy, and that's exactly what's happening. We don't like that. We wish it wasn't the case. We wish somebody had sounded this alarm 20 years ago, but they didn't. And those that did were ignored because some have. This is where we are. You cannot run a system like we have with fewer people working than are retired. You just can't. It does not work mathematically. You can't spend money you don't have. So given that reality, that's another contributor. Another big contributor has been the fact that we've used false assumptions. sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly. We assumed rates of return that we would get from the investment of these dollars that has never happened. I find it interesting that I hear from a lot of people, well, don't put me into a DC plan. I don't want my money gambled in the stock market. Where do you think your current retirement is invested? In the stock market. It always has been. It's why I say if you want to really see what your obligation is, tie it to something that's more stable, like a 30-year Treasury note, but nobody wants to do that. Everybody wants to assume higher rates of return, and indeed, hopefully you get higher rates of return, and historically you have gotten higher rates of return over time in the markets. And yet, people have assumed higher rates of return than we've actually gotten. And because they've assumed higher rates of return, if you assume you're going to get more from the market, that means you have to do what as a legislature in terms of funding? Put in more or less? Less. Think about it. If you assume you're going to get more from here, you put in less from here. So everyone liked the idea of assuming higher rates of return. It sounded good. The itching ears got what they wanted to hear. Oh, we're going to get that kind of good, so we won't have to put as much money in. People also assumed, well, we'll have growth in payroll. More people working at higher wages. How many of you, I won't make you raise hands, but if you're public employees or retired public employees, remember all those pay raises you kept getting? Remember those? Oh yeah, you didn't. Payroll growth wasn't expanding. Oh, and in fact, you remember how you kept having so many people in the office, you didn't know how you're going to get all the work, divvied up because there was so many people and not enough work? Remember that? Oh yeah, it was the exact opposite. You found yourself with every passing year working with fewer and fewer employees because there were not only fewer people, but you weren't getting pay increases. So guess what? Payroll growth was not growing by 4%, which is what has been assumed for years in this state. We've been assuming that it's growing by 4% when everyone knew that was a lie. Everyone knew that was not true. Because you could literally look every single year at whether it was growing or not, and it wasn't. For the last 10 straight years, under Republicans, under Democrats, under this administration, the one that preceded me for 8 years and the one before that, it has been declining. And yet we assumed that it was expanding. Well, guess what? If more people are paying in the assumption, what does the government have to do? Pay in more or less? Less. So we kept assuming more from places, some of which we couldn't predict. You can't predict with a crystal ball what's going to happen in the market, but you do know for a straight up fact whether or not payroll growth is growing or shrinking. And we assumed more than we should have here, even though year after year after year we failed to meet the expectation in terms of market return. And we assumed more than we should have because we knew straight up that it wasn't true in terms of payroll growth. And because we assumed more on both of those, we kept putting less in. That's how we came to this problem. It didn't get done by one person. It didn't get done by one party. It didn't get done by one legislature. It didn't get done by one thing. It got done by death by 1,000 cuts for the last 20 years. And all those things are why we are where we are. Does anyone like it? No. Does everybody wish we could have a do-over? Yes. But life doesn't work that way. You don't get a mulligan on bad financial decisions. You don't. And so this is where we are. So what do we do about it? How do you, again, when I came in, some of the signs that were said and some of the comments that have been made and why I bet most of you are here is because you want to know how are we going to keep the promises that have been made to people. That's the $64,000 question, or the $64 billion question, as the case might be. How do you do that in light of the fiscal reality that I have just shared with you? And some of you, the things that I've shared with you, you know. But for the vast majority, you don't know that. And why would you? It would be like me being an expert in whatever your world is. One of the reasons I ran on this, the reason this was a reason that I said I'm willing to be the governor and to take this head on, is I knew it was failing. I knew it was. Why? Because I'm blessed to have been a person who's worked in this world and lived in this world. I've seen it. I've lived the American dream. I'm very fortunate. A lot of you are aware of this. I grew up well below the poverty level. Family of 8. My father never made 20 grand. We didn't have 2 cents to spend on anything. I never had health care of any kind in my life or access to it till I was an active duty military officer in my 20s. We drove around in $100 rusted out cars. So the people that we talk about, and it's true enough, that what about these people who are banking on this and are counting? I know those people. There's 3 generations of my family, that ahead of me, that of my parents, and that of 2 of my siblings. who have degrees in public education, who have been teachers in the public schools, some of whom have graduate level degrees in public education. All these things that people think, well, you know, this governor and this administration and this legislature, they don't get it. They don't understand. Baloney. I don't just have sympathy for it, I have empathy for it, and there's a big difference between the two. Sympathy is you emotionally feel sorry for somebody. Empathy is you literally know what they're going through because you've experienced it. This is why I was willing to take this kind of grief to actually fix this problem. Because I know how critical it is that we actually be honest with people and come up with a way to keep this promise. So how do you do it? How do you actually keep a promise that others have for decades been misleading people about the ability to keep? We are where we are whether we like it or not. The one thing that has been done that I want to clarify, there's many who have said, well, gee, now that we have an idea out there, we have a plan, now we need to get input from all these different groups that are affected by it and see what they say. That's a good point. That's why we've been doing exactly that for months. I've personally met with, name a group, name any group. The FOP, the KEA, the retired teachers, the jailers, pick a group, any group you could imagine that has a vested interest in this. We've had multiple face-to-face meetings with over the last several months. Multiple. Many of them I've personally had. I guarantee you, the KEA, for example, which has been a vocal, participant in this process, and I appreciate that they do. They represent a whole lot of people who touch pretty much everybody in this state, and they ought to be vocal. That's what they're there for. I guarantee you they have never had as much face-to-face time with the governor ever as they've had with me. Would bet on it. The point is, governors have never sat down with these groups, let alone for hours on end. And anybody who would lead you to believe that their voice hasn't been heard is lying to you straight up. The guy who's the head of superintendents sent out a letter recently to other superintendents telling them they need to shut down the schools so people can protest what's being done, saying the reason he sent that out, when he was asked by the media, why did you send out a letter like that? He said, well, our voice hasn't been heard. He has personally met with me and my team 5 times or more. He's lying to you. Don't let people lie to you like they've lied to you thus far. Does that mean his reasoning for wanting to have this addressed is wrong? No, but the methodology should be factual. The approach to this should be civil discourse. As somebody said when we were outside on our way in here, we should be able to have civil discourse. We should have it based on facts. So how are we going to do this? The months and months and months that we have been addressing this, meeting for hundreds of hours with all of these different groups that represent active public employees and retired public employees. Multiple meetings. And the double-digit number of meetings, I don't even know how many we've had with House and Senate leadership. For 2, 3, 5, 6, 7 hours at a time. Weekdays, weeknights, weekends. You know how many Sunday afternoons and evenings many of your leadership in the House and Senate have spent working on this issue all summer long? This idea that this just kind of popped out and now, this is literally the culmination of all these meetings. Is it a perfect plan? Of course it's not. Is it possible to come up with a perfect plan? Of course it's not. Is this the only plan that will ever address this situation now and forevermore? And if we lock this in, nothing ever could be discussed again? Of course it's not. Is the alternative of doing nothing because we can't have a perfect plan, a good one? Of course it's not. Failure to act is a guarantee that the system will fail. You want to guarantee how you're not going to keep the promise? You keep kicking this can. You keep ignoring the reality of what's coming. The largest of the plans, which has far more retirees than active workers right now, the KERS non-hazardous plan, will fail in the next handful of years. 3, 5, 6, I don't know. Depends on what happens in the markets. But last year, for example, a full third of it. When you pay out $1 billion, yes, you'll get some appreciation in the market. But when you have 1.9 left after you just spent 1, you only have a handful of years before you bleed out. That one will fail first. So KERS non-hazardous will go, and then these other ones that have increasingly higher numbers, They'll fail in some years after that. And if you think, well, that if they have 3 to 5 years, the other ones have 12 to 15 years, I wouldn't bet on it. KERS non-hazardous 10 years ago was more fully funded than any of those plans that Senator Bowen just talked about. It had a higher rate of funding. It was more well funded than any plan that exists right now in Kentucky 10 years ago. This happens like that because it is what Forbes, among others, when they look at states, and ours among them, they refer to Kentucky and have for some years, which is why people should have known and have known in some cases what's coming. They've been referring to us as a death spiral state. Why do they say that? Because that's exactly what we're in. Once the gig is up, once the system is insolvent, once you have more retirees than workers, once you've made assumptions for an extended period of time that are faulty, the system is broken. It is broken. The only way back, and this is the third or fourth time I've asked the question now without answering, how then do you save the system? It's on the backs of everybody who pays taxes. That's it. And when I hear people say you're trying to fix the system on the back of this group or that group or these employees or that employees, nonsense. Are they being asked to contribute? You bet. But guess who else is? The 90-something% of Kentuckians who aren't in these systems and are never going to be in these systems. They're also being asked to participate, and truth be told, they're being asked to participate a whole lot more proportionally because they literally get nothing out of it personally. What they do get is the services and provision of services provided by people who are teachers and law enforcement officers, and you bet we need those things, and we want those things, so you bet we're getting value, but not personally. When people say you're taking it out of my pocket as an employee, and you're taking money from my pocket, you shouldn't be doing that. Well, we're taking money from everyone's pocket. Everyone. If you're a taxpayer in this state, you are going to be obligated. So let me come back to something I mentioned earlier. How do you pay this off? How do you fix it? How do you keep the promise? This level dollar funding that I mentioned is something that has never been required in the past. This is part of how we got into this problem. If we had paid our freight every time along the way, we wouldn't be in this problem. But we didn't. And we allowed ourselves to be tricked, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly, but we did. And now we've dug ourselves into a deep hole. How do we get out? You figure out how deep the hole is. And we have done that. We did pay actuaries to literally audit every one of the plans, and we've come up with a pretty clear idea of what the obligation is. And again, even that is to say that people still disagree on what assumptions. And some say it's 40, and some say it's 60, and some say it's 80. Again, there's still disagreement, but in general, we know roughly where it is. So take that middle of the road. Take that assumption of 60. I truly would rather err on the side of 80, but it will make the solution even more expensive for taxpayers. But let's just say it's 60, which is frankly modest, and I think, if anything, still a little bit generous in terms of the assumptions. But let's say it's that. That means that we owe essentially $2 billion a year for the next 30 years. And let me digress for one quick second, and I'll come back to that. I hear people say, well, we need to legalize marijuana in this state because we'll get $100 million in tax money. Yeah, the people of Kentucky will have to smoke pot and pay taxes on it for 600 years to pay that off. I mean, seriously, that's a ridiculous suggestion. I mean, I appreciate that it's a suggestion, but it's not even close to being able to fix this problem. The same for casino gambling and other things, which these things are suckers' bets. They sound great, but all that glitters is not gold. We are going to absolutely need to, and I'll tell you, this is a whole topic. We could have a 14-hour conversation on this subject that I'll just touch on here. We absolutely need to relook at our tax code in this state, period. We just do. I've been clear about that time and time again. It's antiquated, it's outdated, it's counterproductive, it's uncompetitive. That's a whole nother topic. Clearly, that's going to be a contributor. It has to be. It is already. That's where the money comes from. But the fact is, where are we going to come up with $2 billion a year? That's being conservative. And that's assuming there's no growth, no depreciation due to inflation, no increased cost due to increase in health care or whatever the case might be. Bear in mind as well, all these dollars I'm talking about, 40, 60, 80, pick your number. Not one of those numbers, not any of the numbers you hear being discussed in private conversation or with the media or anyone else, not one of those numbers takes into consideration the cost of providing health care to retirees. That's a whole separate problem. And guess what? That's billions of dollars underfunded as well. 6 to 8 billion just for that. That's a whole nother area. Let's leave that alone for now and pretend that's not a problem, because it's only 10% the problem of the problem we're talking about. Where do we get $2 billion? We get it from taxpayers. That's where it's always come from. That's where it's going to come from again. That's about 20% of our current annual income as a state. Think about that. Last time, in the last budget, I put in $1.2 billion into the pension system for each of the last 2 years. That created, if you remember and were paying attention, a fair bit of angst among a whole lot of people. A lot of weeping and gnashing of teeth. We had to cut. We had to cut 9% out of some things, 4.5% out of others. Some were exempted. But to come up with $1.2 billion, we had to cut like we've never cut before. It's why we put more money in than has ever been put in before. And yet that 1.2 in relation to 60 plus is just a drop in the bucket. I heard from people saying, well, it's a good thing we fixed that. We didn't fix diddly. We just stopped bleeding as hard for 1 year, and now it's second year. But here's what we have to realize. That entire 1.2 is we're going to have to come up with roughly another 800. We're going to have to keep doing that. Oh, and guess what? The cuts that allowed us to do that have already been made. We don't get to add the fat back to cut it again to find the savings. We have to keep the 1.2, which we sort of have locked in due to the previous cuts. But guess what? We need another 800 or so, being conservative, on top of that every single year. Where's it going to come from? We don't get to print it. We can't force people to come here. We can't force companies to expand here. We can't force people to retire here. Where's it going to come from? These are questions people don't want to ask because they don't want the answer. The answer is it's coming from the taxpayers that have no choice but to be here, and many do. And many businesses have a choice. And they look at the credit rating of states, and they look at the viability of communities, and whether a community in its own jurisdiction can actually pay its bills, because no smart employer wants to go put capital expenditures and investment into the ground and build a building and hire people in a community where the community's bleeding out, because they know they're going to be left holding the bag, and nobody wants to be left holding the bag. That's the reality. So given that reality, what can we do? We suck it up is what we do. And we have shared sacrifice is what we do. And we do look at every option for paying 20% of our entire intake for what affects, and people don't like this, but I'm telling you what concerns me, and one of the reasons I'm challenging this, is if this did fail. If I'm the last governor that could kick this. There's one kick left before the first system fails. That's a fact. And there's nobody who knows anything about actuarial reality or finances that will tell you otherwise, and be honest with you. There's one kick left for the KERS non-hazardous plan. I could kick it, go around, cut ribbons, eat some barbecue, have a good time, and sail the heck on out of here. I'm not going to do that. I didn't run to do that. I'm not going to do it. But it is going to implode. So how do you keep that from happening? You basically have shared sacrifice, and everybody sucks it up. And we all pitch in. This is a reality. What I don't want to see happen is to have class warfare. And by class warfare, I'm talking about the 90-something% of people that are paying for the single-digit percentage of people that we're talking about here. And if you think there's anger and resentment among the single-digit percentage who do important jobs, and no one questions that. No one's questioning the value of a prison guard or a law enforcement officer or a teacher or a construction worker or a fill in the blank. Nobody questions the value and the input and the importance and the necessity of that. But that is a single-digit percentage of the people in the state that are working. And if it now isn't just 10 or 20, but becomes 30 and 40 and 50%, which is what we're trending toward if we don't structurally address this, do you think the 90-something% are not going to get outraged at a certain point? Do you think you're not? It's already starting to happen. Trust me, I hear it. And shame on us if we allow that to happen. That's an abdication of responsibility on the part of those of us that you elected to go and fix this problem. This is the time for the big pants to be put on and for the adults to come into the room and make hard decisions. Because that's exactly where we are. And we are trending from 10 to 20 to 30 to 40. Those of you in county government see this already. Statutorily, You are required next year, if you're in county or local government, you're going to see your non-hazardous contributions increase by 50%. And for your hazard duty folks by 60%. So if you think your budget is constrained now in your communities, imagine that you're now 50 to 60% more constrained. That's next year alone, guaranteed, not hypothetical, statutorily 100% guarantee that you're going to see that contribution go up. If we don't pass this bill, which actually accounts for the fact that nobody, with rare exception, has the money to make that increase. There's a handful of cities and or counties in the state, a handful. Literally, probably you could count them on one hand, that could afford to make that kind of a contribution next year. Which is why in this bill we recognize that and say in 2019, we're going to hold it flat, that what you're currently paying will not go up in fiscal year 19. Some of you very quickly and astutely are going, well, there's a can kick right there. You're exactly right. But let me come back to why. In year 2, 2020, it says the increase between what you're now paying and what you really need to pay to make the true arc, and mandatorily do it with level dollar funding by breaking it into 30 pieces and funding it in full, then in 2020 you go 1/3 of the difference. In 2021, fiscal year 2021, which starts in the summer of 2020, you go to 2/3. And by fiscal year 2022, you go to 100% of the difference between where we are now, the 1.2, and the essentially $2 billion that it's going to cost. We essentially built that in because we know these cities and counties can't afford to do it now. And in fairness, and this is about the only nod, I don't make decisions based on political expediency. Perhaps you've noticed that. Only an idiot would run for office saying they're going to do this and then actually do it if they were thinking they were going to build a political career. I'm not doing this to build a political career. I'm doing it because it needs to be done, because I have 9 children and I want my kids to live in Kentucky and I don't want this place to bleed out. That's why I'm doing it. But I'll tell you this, the only nod to political reality is, could you imagine if you know for a fact that starting next summer your costs of doing everything are going up 50 to 60% as it relates to all the people that you employ in every facet of government? Could you imagine running for re-election in 2018 saying, oh, hey, starting next summer, a few months before you vote for me, I'm cutting 1/3 of all the people who work for this city, 1/3 of all the people who work for this county? You're going to find some person who doesn't know anything but will say, well, I'll just vote for me and I won't do that. And people will vote for that person because people wish that reality was not reality, and they'll vote accordingly. The reason we're waiving it for 1 year is so that people know exactly what's coming in years 2, 3, 4, and beyond. And the people that are bold enough and wise enough and convicted enough to run anyway will be the ones that run. And the people will have time to digest and choose wisely the people who have what it takes to be financially responsible. That's why we're doing this. That's why we've built into this a feathering in process. It's why, again, I come back to what I said in the beginning. This idea that this just got pulled out of the air, and this is my idea or someone else's idea or Joe's idea or something, nonsense. This is the collective effort of thousands of hours, hundreds of hours of specific meetings, all in combination coming up with something that started out very differently, as Senator Bowen will tell you. It went through a whole lot of machinations, and it kept being changed every time we met with a group, both active employees and retirees. Every time we met with a group, the thing began to change, and it began to morph, and so extensions were made. Let me talk about teachers, for example, because it's topical. 38% of them have 5 years or less. Interestingly, for those of you that are teachers or have been teachers, you know that in the first 5 years, essentially, you're not vested. It's the equivalent of being sort of a tier 3 employer or whatever the case might be. You don't have the stake in a system and in a plan that you would if you'd been there longer than that. By law, inviolable contract or otherwise, they don't have the rights that those that have been there 5 years or more have. That's just reality. It would have been absolutely legal and arguably financially prudent to say for those 38% of teachers that they're just going to be treated as people who have no rights, and they're going to go straight into a DC plan whether they like it or not. That is absolutely, people could have sued all day long. It wouldn't have made a lick's worth of difference. But the decision, based on all the feedback from so many groups, was specifically for that group, that wasn't what we're going to do. That if a person's in their first year as a teacher, and expected to be able to work for 27 years and get a defined benefit for the rest of their life based on those years of service, then that's exactly what we're going to give them. Why? Because it's obligated legally? No. But morally, I don't even know if it's a moral issue. It was ultimately decided it was the right thing to do. Those are the kind of conversations that have been happening for months. The same could be said for any other number of groups. Pick one. Where people started and where we ended up. Why does this look so different than what the consultants recommended, the people who audited the plans and were paid to give us objective, non-personally binding advice? They gave us suggestions they said take back COLAs. They were never accounted for. They were never accrued for. They said take those back. They never should have been paid. It was illegal, and indeed it was. It's not in any contract anywhere. But the reality is people have made an adjustment, and somebody who's now making $2,800 a month, and if you suddenly took it back would be making $2,200 a month. I'm just picking numbers. That's a pretty dramatic change. That is more of a moral issue. So again, the legislators said we're not going to do that to people. Do we have every legal right to do it? Yes. Is it financially appropriate? Yes. Is it the right thing to do? No. So we're not going to do it. That's why this plan, while not perfect, and while not giving everybody exactly what they want, gives far more to people than could have been done, and financially ought to be done. This proposal that we have put out there is a 30-plus year fix. It will take 4 years just to phase in the true starting to pay, and from that point forward, paying the full tranche each time, the level dollar funding, another 30 years on top of that. This is a 34-year fix that we're talking about. Some of us in this room won't be living when this finally gets paid off. Some will. And the reality is, if we don't do this, it will fail. And we do not have an option for where to come up with the money once it fails. And the promises, people say, well, the promise is made, they better send me the check. They'll send you the check, it just won't clear. So what good is it? A lie is a lie. An empty promise is a lie. And whether someone meant to give it to you, knew they were giving it to you, it doesn't matter. If there's no money in the bank and there's nowhere to get the money to put in the bank, then those checks will not clear. This is where we are. So forgive me, I was going to say just a couple things and then take your questions. I hope I've laid out for you in some measure how we got to where we are, why we got to where we are. And with that said, what questions on any front, ideally related to this, and if there are truly none on this, I'll answer questions about anything. But I'm guessing you came here to talk about the pensions.